I was at a dinner party recently, and someone brought up the upcoming 250th anniversary of the nation. They were talking about, the planned fireworks, the commemorative coins, all the grand unity speeches being drafted in Washington. And there was this bright, almost performative optimism in their voice, the kind of forced cheer you see in corporate brochures. They seemed utterly convinced that a milestone on a calendar could somehow stitch together a fractured society. But then the conversation shifted. A woman across the table, she's a faculty member at a prestigious university, began describing her week. And she spoke with this strange, almost clinical satisfaction about deconstructing the very founding myths the anniversary is supposed to celebrate. To her, the flags and the history, they weren't symbols of a shared project. They were like specimens to be dissolved in a vat of ideological acid. And the room just went quiet. The unity they had just been toasting felt suddenly, violently paper thin. I looked around the table and I noticed something really unsettling. These were successful, high-achieving people, yet almost none of them mentioned their families or their neighbors or any sense of duty to the future. Instead, the talk turned to identity, to grievances, and this deep-seated loneliness that even the expensive wine couldn't mask. It wasn't a celebration of a living civilization. It felt like a room full of people sitting inside a magnificent building, completely unaware that the load-bearing walls were being systematically hollowed out from the inside. That evening stayed with me. It made me realize that we were approaching this 250th milestone with the wrong tools. We're treating it like a party, but if you look at the soaring rates of social atomization, the capture of our institutions, and the death of meritocracy, what we actually need is a clinical diagnosis. When the very organic structures that hold a society together, the family, a shared truth, the pursuit of excellence, when those are rebranded as targets for deconstruction, we aren't just facing a cultural disagreement, we're witnessing the systematic entropy of a civilization. And the winter we are entering requires a much more sober strategy than fireworks. That moment, that feeling of needing a diagnosis, that's really the mission of this deep dive. We are going to take the dispassionate lens of what's called social functionalism, the idea that society is this complex system of interconnected parts, and perform a kind of structural integrity inspection of our civilization's load-bearing walls. Our goal is to assess clinically if the organic structures holding things up are failing. And we're focusing on 3 areas where this systemic entropy seems most visible: the decline of social connection, the erosion of competence in our key institutions, and the dissolution of the shared beliefs that are supposed to bind us together.
And I think it's the only responsible way to approach it. What often looks like a high-level political or cultural conflict is, in functional terms, really a collapse of the underlying organic structures. So when we peel back the political rhetoric and apply this clinical perspective, the first wall we have to examine is the most foundational one. It's the psychological cost of this entropy, or what we can call social atomization. So let's just begin with the hard data on what is now. It's officially classified as a modern behavioral epidemic.
Loneliness.
An epidemic.
An epidemic. And to understand the gravity of that, we have to start with a really precise definition. Loneliness is not just objective social isolation. It's not about how many people are physically around you.
Right.
Loneliness is defined as subjective distress that results from a discrepancy between the social relationships you want to have and the relationships you perceive yourself as having.
So you could be in the middle of a crowded city.
You could be in the middle of Manhattan, surrounded by thousands of people, and be profoundly, deeply lonely. That distinction feels crucial because it shifts the problem from just an external circumstance to an internal emotional state. It's this profound feeling of being unmoored. But if it's just a feeling, how does the data justify calling it an epidemic on par with a physical disease?
Because the physiological effects are terrifying. Loneliness is clinically described as a lethal behavioral toxin.
A lethal toxin?
Yeah. The stress hormones, the inflammation, the chronic fight or flight state it puts your body in, it all translates into a physical mortality risk that's comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
15 a day.
Or severe obesity. And let's really pause on the numbers here. An estimated 162,000 American deaths annually are attributed to social isolation.
Wow.
Now, that figure, according to reputable public health research, is higher than the number of annual deaths from very high-profile physical illnesses, like breast cancer or stroke.
162,000 deaths. If a new exotic virus were killing that many people every year, every single governmental and institutional resource would be mobilized instantly.
Without question.
But because this is a social pathogen, a structural failing, it seems to fall completely below the public policy radar. What explains this surge? Is this just the modern condition, or is this something new, something recent?
It's distinctly modern, and it is rapidly accelerating. It's interesting, the British historian Fay Alberti noted that the English word loneliness didn't even exist in its current usage until around 1800.
Really?
Yeah, it emerged alongside the early phases of industrialization, which by its nature eroded the tight-knit village and community structures that had existed for centuries.
So for most of human history, people were rarely alone.
They were almost always embedded in a family or some kind of communal structure. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and the problem has just exploded. We've seen the prevalence of severe, self-reported loneliness effectively double in just the last few decades.
So we've gone from a world where loneliness was so rare it needed a new word, to a world where it's the default psychological baseline for millions of people.
Exactly. I mean, consider a recent study that found an astonishing 76% of adult Californians. And California is sort of the symbol of modern, high-tech Western life, suffered from moderate to severe loneliness.
76%.
And this distress isn't limited to the elderly, which is a common stereotype.
Yeah.
We see these peaks occurring in the late 20s, then again in the mid-50s, and then again in the late 80s.
So what's happening at those points in life?
Well, the late 20s peak correlates really strongly with the aftermath of leaving the immediate scaffolding of education and then the struggle to establish stable adult relationships. The mid-50s peak often aligns with, the empty nest syndrome, professional stagnation, maybe the realization of unmet aspirations.
So these are transitional phases where your existing social support, or your lack of it, is tested most severely. And it seems like the common thread linking this epidemic of loneliness, the surge in suicides, the opioid crisis, it has to be the social enemy, this disconnection.
It is the unifying factor. This disconnection is a direct result of rapid technological growth, of social media's kind of performative engagement,
Right.
accelerated globalization, and the political and cultural polarization that has just ripped our natural affinity groups apart. The cumulative effect of living in this highly fractured environment is elevated chronic stress.
And we have data on that too.
The data confirms this absolutely. Self-reported stress and worry in the U.S. have increased by a staggering 25% over just a recent 12-year period. The system is just generating anxiety faster than we can cope.
And that inability to cope, that raw, unbuffered anxiety, it brings us directly to the functional breakdown of what social scientists once universally agreed was civilization's foundational unit, the family. I recently heard an account that it perfectly encapsulated the human reality of this radical atomization, the kind of psychological terrain that data is describing. It was the story of a young man, let's call him Leo, who lives in one of those minimalist high-rise apartments in a major American city. By all external metrics, Leo is a success. Good job, nice clothes. But he is a victim of radical atomization. He grew up in the quiet aftermath of what he called a modern optimized divorce. He was ping-ponging between 2, then 4 separate households until the very concept of a family center, a fixed point of gravitational safety, just vanished for him. Now, in his late 20s, he might have 500 digital connections. But when his car broke down on a Friday night, he realized he had no one, literally no one. He could call for immediate physical help without it being an exchange of money or some formalized transaction.
That absence of uncodified, non-transactional support, that is the absolute hallmark of a structural failure. When you describe his life, the persistent echoing silence, the feeling that he has to perform a perfect life online, this defensive narcissism that masks the fact he feels like a ghost Leo's story, is a tragic illustration of how the decline of the nuclear family functions as a factory for loneliness.
A factory for loneliness. Let's use that as the springboard into the academic view, the functionalist view, because it moves the family out of the realm of, say, moral judgment and into a structural analysis.
Precisely. Functionalist sociologists, they treat the nuclear family as civilization's foundational defensive unit. A sociologist named George Murdoch, who did a lot of cross-cultural research, argued that the nuclear family is a universal structure, precisely because it fulfills 4 essential functions that reduce chaos and conflict in any society.
Okay, so let's run through those 4 essential chaos-reducing functions. What are they?
So first, you have sexual regulation. This just ensures that sexual behavior is channeled into stable, accepted relationships, which reduces the conflict and jealousy that would arise from unlimited sexual competition.
Makes sense.
Second, reproduction procreation. Simple survival, really. The family is the mechanism that ensures the continuation of society by producing new members. Third is the economic function. Historically, the family was a unit of production. In modern society, it serves as the primary unit of consumption and the main mechanism for the inheritance of wealth and property.
And the last one?
The last one is the educational function, or primary socialization. This is where you teach children the core norms, the values, the language necessary to participate in the broader social world. Without that functional handover, the whole system just jams.
And then another sociologist, Talcott Parsons, he refined this view specifically for modern, industrial, post-war American society. He agreed that while specialized institutions like schools and hospitals took over some of these functions, the family retained two absolutely irreducible roles.
That's right. The first irreducible role is still the primary socialization of children. Parsons famously called the family a personality factory.
A personality factory.
Its job is to produce workers and citizens who are committed to the necessary rules, the work ethic, and the belief systems, like an achievement orientation and respect for private property that are required for industrial economic life. It's the essential bridge between the isolated individual and the massive impersonal apparatus of society.
And the second role is maybe the most relevant to our discussion of stress and atomization. It's the stabilization of adult personalities. This is the famous warm bath function.
It's the functional opposite of the atomized anxiety experienced by Leo. Parsons argued that the nuclear family provides this deep emotional security and acceptance, acting as a crucial release valve.
A release valve for what?
For the strains and stresses of modern competitive working life. The relentless pressure, the status competition, the threat of unemployment. If the competitive economic sphere is cold and ruthless, the family is supposed to be the warm bath that washes away the alienation and stabilizes the adult personality. This, in turn, contributes directly to the stability and productivity of the entire wider society.
So if we look at Leo's persistent echoing silence, what we're seeing is the catastrophic failure of that stabilization function. The causal pathology, seen through this lens, is that the systematic delegitimization and dissolution of the nuclear family leads directly to radical social atomization, the isolated, authorityless self.
Which then manifests as the lethal mental health and stress epidemic we were just talking about.
Right.
And this is where the state steps in. The state has to expand into a therapeutic, a regulatory, a financial role to manage the self-inflicted pathologies of disconnection, the loneliness, the addiction, the anxiety that the foundational social unit was designed to prevent in the first place.
So it's a functionally expensive substitute for organic community.
Exactly.
Now, this analysis provides a very powerful argument for the family's structural necessity, but we have to maintain that dispassionate clinical perspective. Functionalism, as a theory, has received some pretty profound critiques. We can't claim the family is a flawless structure that always fulfills its role as a warm bath. We have to look at the dark side.
We absolutely must. The functionalist model is often accused of ignoring family dysfunctions. I mean, the reality is that the family is often not a haven, but an arena for profound conflict, violence, and emotional cruelty. The sources of nurture are often the sources of the greatest pain.
And the statistics here are pretty grim. They illustrate the severity of that dysfunction.
They are. The paradox is clear. While the family provides life, it is also a context for death. Globally, almost half of all female homicide victims are killed by intimate partners or other family members. Functionalism's focus on maintaining order tends to minimize or overlook these severe dysfunctions. It misses the intense emotional cruelty, financial abuse, and physical violence that can occur precisely because of the closed, high-stakes nature of the familial bond.
Then you have the ideological critiques, which argue the structure itself is harmful. I'm thinking of the Marxist and feminist schools of thought, which see the family as reinforcing systemic inequality. How does the Marxist critique specifically frame the family's function for capitalism?
Well, the Marxist critique is fundamentally skeptical of the family serving society in general. They argue it primarily serves the interests of the dominant ruling class.
How so?
It reproduces the future workforce children, free of charge for the capitalist system, saving the state and industry enormous social costs. And furthermore, it socializes children into conformity, punctuality, and the uncritical belief systems necessary for economic involvement.
And that stabilizing function, the warm bath, which Parsons saw as beneficial to society. Marxists would redefine that as merely beneficial to the system.
Precisely. They call the warm bath a crucial safety valve. The alienated male worker, frustrated by his exploitation in the factory, releases that tension and frustration at home, thereby stabilizing his adult personality just enough to return to work the next day without threatening the capitalist system itself.
So it's a mechanism for absorbing the human fallout from systemic alienation.
That's the argument. It reframes the family as an emotional shock absorber for economic injustice, rather than a protective unit against the world.
And what about the feminist critique of the nuclear structure?
Well, feminist sociologists argue that the structure is fundamentally patriarchal and a source of exploitation, primarily through the unequal division of labor. This is the persistent issue of the second shift.
The second shift.
Even when women enter the workforce and achieve parity in instrumental economic roles, they are still overwhelmingly expected to handle the bulk of childcare and housework. Studies show married working women often perform 15 or more hours of additional unpaid labor per week compared to their male partners.
Which means the family structure reinforces a kind of economic dependence and limits women's access to high-level career achievement.
It confines them. The assignment of gendered roles within the family, the expressive role for the woman, the instrumental role for the man, it keeps women in a dependent, often economically disadvantaged position, even in modern society. So they conclude that the structure perpetuates inequality, not stability.
Okay, so we have severe internal dysfunctions and powerful arguments that the nuclear family is an engine of inequality. Yet the clinical data shows its dissolution is a lethal toxin causing mass social anomie. If the structure is flawed, why insist on its reclamation?
Because the functionalist response relies on empirical necessity, not on moral or nostalgic idealism. The question isn't, is the family perfect? The question is, what structure is demonstrably better at preventing lethal social atomization?
And the answer is?
The diagnosis of the loneliness epidemic demands a functional reclamation of the family, because it remains the only primary structure we have that is capable of providing the necessary depth of connection and psychological stability to withstand systemic stress.
So how do we move beyond just lamenting the decline and move toward a functional reclamation? I mean, where do you even start?
Well, the research on loneliness itself provides a really unexpected path. Studies from the NIH show a strong inverse association between loneliness and wisdom.
Loneliness and wisdom.
Yes. People who score highly on validated wisdom scales, meaning they possess measurable attributes of wisdom, do not experience chronic loneliness.
So the antidote to atomization is not just more people, but an internal cognitive resilience or wisdom.
It suggests the problem is internal as much as it is external. And wisdom, in this context, it isn't about intelligence or IQ. It's a personality trait with 5 measurable components: empathy and compassion, the ability to feel for others, emotional regulation, the capacity to manage and understand your own feelings, the ability to self-reflect on your own behavior and motives, acceptance of diverse perspectives, recognizing complexity, and finally spirituality, or a sense of connection to something larger than yourself.
That's fascinating. If these are the components of wisdom, and wisdom prevents loneliness, it means fighting the epidemic involves behavioral interventions designed to increase these traits.
Precisely. The research indicates that these components are not fixed. They can be increased through specific behavioral and cognitive interventions. The path toward resilience, toward combating the isolation that is killing 162,000 people a year, might involve deliberately cultivating these traits.
And where are these traits traditionally forged and tested?
In the messy, demanding, high-stakes context of the family unit, which demands empathy, emotional regulation, and self-reflection on a daily basis. So the reclamation of the family is therefore linked to the cultivation of the wisdom necessary for individual resilience.
So if social atomization is the psychological breakdown that results from the collapse of that foundational unit, let's now shift our focus to the institutional level. What happens when the isolated, stressed individuals we just discussed try to rely on the functional, specialized systems of civilization? The hospitals, the infrastructure, our defenses. This brings us to the second load-bearing wall, the erosion of competence and the abandonment of the pragmatic imperative of meritocracy.
And this is very much a structural diagnosis. Civilization is defined by its ability to deliver reliable, precise outcomes through highly specialized systems. If those systems become corrupted by factors unrelated to objective ability, trust evaporates and inefficiency becomes lethal.
I recently spoke with a senior administrator in a prestigious university hospital, someone with 3 decades of experience focused on achieving objective competence. You know, the kind where a millimeter of error in the surgical theater is the difference between life and death. We can call her Sarah. And her account provided a chilling, real-world window into how this institutional corrosion begins. Sarah was overseeing the search for a new departmental head, a critical surgical position. She came armed with spreadsheets detailing surgical success rates, patient outcomes, rigorous academic publications.
The hard data.
The hard data. Yet she watched in disbelief as the conversation shifted entirely away from these metrics. The focus moved from who is the most demonstrably capable to whose appointment fits the current institutional narrative of ideological representation. She said she felt like she was speaking a dead language when she brought up the historical precedent of meritocratic excellence. There was a palpable fear in the room, a sense that the common denominators of truth and skill were being sacrificed for identity-based optics.
And what happened?
She saw a brilliant, young, but ideologically non-compliant surgeon quietly withdraw his application, sensing the systemic entropy had accelerated past the point of return.
Sarah's observation is a perfect clinical description of systemic entropy. It's the slow rusting and freezing up of a machine that no one bothers to oil anymore. We have to define meritocracy not as some abstract moral ideal, but as a pragmatic imperative. Meritocracy, this idea goes all the way back to Plato, that power or position is allocated according to virtue and competence, is the prerequisite for a functional, high-trust society.
Because if the competence required for a complex system like, say, air traffic control or surgery or bridge building, if that is eroded, the entire society suffers a catastrophic complexity and inefficiency.
Absolutely. The core structural necessity is simple. Policies that prioritize identity or ideology over objective capability introduce systemic fragility. It's a violation of the functionalist principle that every part of the system must perform its task efficiently. When we talk about competence, we aren't talking about philosophy. We're talking about outcomes in systems that demand precision.
And we don't have to speculate about the impact. There was a recent, highly detailed report that analyzed exactly how this deconstructive impact is playing out in one of our most critical institutions, medical schools.
This report was a structural integrity inspection of the highest order. It analyzed top U.S. institutions, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. The finding was unequivocal. Diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI policies are actively eroding meritocracy and, as a direct consequence, jeopardizing public health outcomes.
Jeopardizing public health.
Yes. DEI is described in the sources as an aggressive extension of affirmative action, openly and deliberately substituting characteristics like race and gender for demonstrated talent and achievement.
So this isn't just a cultural disagreement then. It's a direct conflict between ideological requirements and institutional functionality.
It is functional conflict. The report documented how entrenched this ideology is. DEI is embedded in medical courses, and often this content is actually displacing core scientific curriculum.
So you're sitting through ideological training when you should be studying biochemistry or anatomy.
Potentially, yes. And the erosion of standards also extends to faculty hiring. Faculty are increasingly being hired for ideological conformity, their willingness to write loyalty statements and participate in anti-racism training, rather than for academic distinction or groundbreaking research.
So the internal culture of the institution is shifting from a pursuit of scientific excellence to a pursuit of ideological compliance. And this inevitably trickles down to who gets admitted to become a physician.
It creates a self-reinforcing loop. The admissions concerns highlighted in the report are stark. Merit is explicitly taking a backseat to fulfilling racial and demographic preferences. This means favoring underrepresented groups with statistically lower MCAT scores and lower undergraduate GPAs. The report's recommendation is clear and, frankly, brutal in its simplicity. We must mandate the use of objective admissions criteria and enforce public transparency.
Why is that last part, the public transparency, so important?
Because the stakes are existential. Doctors simply must be chosen from the most intellectually gifted and studious individuals available. If you, as the public, can't trust that the system is selecting for the most competent, if you suspect your surgeon was chosen for demographic reasons rather than skill, institutional trust collapses entirely. The meritocracy defense demands transparency because competence cannot be a secret. It must be a verifiable standard.
We do have to address the strong philosophical pushback against meritocracy, though, because it's often challenged as a flawed ideal, a justification for wealth concentration, rather than a true path to success. The idea that the world is built purely on meritocratic hard work it's complex.
It is. The philosophical critique points out the difficulty in even defining hard work. Does it mean time spent? The inherent difficulty of the task, the emotional pain endured. There's no consistent objective metric. And furthermore, critics argue that the notion that we live in a pure meritocracy gives people a false sense of control over their destiny, and it justifies massive social inequality.
And what about the role of luck? We so often see successful people claiming sole credit for their merit, ignoring all the circumstantial advantages they might have had.
That's where the data gets really interesting. Research suggests that merit skill, effort, intelligence is the most important element of success until you reach, say, the top 5 to 10% of any given field.
Okay.
At that elite level, the marginal skill differences basically disappear, and circumstance, timing, and sheer luck play a disproportionately larger role in determining who becomes truly transcendent. So for critics, this means meritocracy is often just a rationalization used by the lucky to hoard resources and power.
So if luck matters so significantly at the top, and if hard work is so hard to define, why maintain meritocracy as the central organizing principle? Why not just embrace the moral goal of providing a fine life for everyone, regardless of talent?
And that's the critical functional counterargument. If the moral goal were indeed to ensure everyone received the same outcome regardless of input, the fine life on a platter scenario, that society would immediately collapse into a pit of total chaos and dysfunction within a generation.
Right.
Society must, as a structural necessity, incentivize and reward the people who are objectively competent at specialized tasks. The functional necessity of competence overrides abstract moralistic goals for equality of outcome in specialized high-risk fields. If the bridge designer or the surgeon is mediocre, the entire structure fails.
And this demand for competence even extends to how we view governance. It brings in concepts like political meritocracy.
Yes, the concept of epistocracy, or political meritocracy, is an old one, tracing all the way back to Plato's philosopher kings. It proposes that political power should be allocated based on virtue and competence. Now, while fully non-democratic models, like the Confucian model, are controversial, the modern defense of epistocracy often arises as a response to perceived voter incompetence and the fragility of modern governance.
But even if we reject pure epistocracy, the democratic ideal itself seems to assume a form of democratic meritocracy.
It absolutely does. A functioning democracy inherently assumes that elections should select virtuous and competent leaders. The role of competence is paramount, not just in hospitals and engineering firms, but in institutional leadership. If the systems we rely on, both technical and political, fail to prioritize competence, systemic entropy just accelerates.
So the strategy for restoration must be the meritocracy defense, a recalibration toward the primacy of objective competence. The restoration of excellence isn't an act of exclusion, but a necessary, a pragmatic step to ensure institutional functionality and ultimately public safety and trust.
We have to defend objective capability as a functional truth. To allow ideology to consistently hollow out institutions like medicine by sacrificing verifiable skill is to voluntarily introduce fragility into the core load-bearing walls of our civilization.
So we've diagnosed the psychological breakdown, the atomization, and the institutional failure, which is the erosion of competence. Our third and final wall is the ideological one, the loss of a shared reality, which is fundamentally about the destruction of the narratives that create social adhesives.
And this is perhaps the most difficult failure to diagnose because it happens in the realm of symbols and meaning. Any stable collectivity needs a symbolic foundation founding myths to create shared meaning, to foster communal bonds, and to give history significance. These narratives delineate boundaries and create a shared thought world that holds everything else together.
And when that shared thought world dissolves, the consequences are immediate for the transmission of culture. I recently learned of a really poignant illustration of this, centering on a high school history teacher. This teacher, let's call him Mr. Miller, was standing in his classroom preparing for the 250th anniversary. And he was trying to explain the social adhesive of the founding myth to a highly cynical group of teenagers. He held up the Constitution, not as some holy text, but as a functional blueprint for civilizational continuity, a set of operating instructions for a complex system. But his students, influenced by the corrosive online environment and popular deconstructionist narratives, were armed with what felt like a universal solvent. They dismantled every hero, every value, every historical narrative he presented.
Wow.
To them, the language of stoic patriotism, the idea of duty to a shared experiment, it just sounded like white noise. Mr. Miller described feeling this profound sense of systemic failure, realizing he was trying to teach continuity to a generation that had been taught only how to tear down and critique, but never how to build or belong.
Mr. Miller's struggle perfectly illustrates the functional role of these myths. They are not merely fabrications or lies. They are the foundational narrative upon which a community's values, its beliefs, and its aspirations are constructed. They provide the essential sense of continuity that bridges the present with a revered past, binding generations together through a shared story.
And in the American context, the master myth, the ultimate foundational narrative, has always been the American dream.
It is the defining meta-narrative. The American dream transcends being just an aspirational goal. It encapsulates ideals of opportunity, hard work, success, upward mobility. It functions as the grand idea, the grand récit, that offers society both justification and legitimation and says, the system is fair, and if you work, you can succeed.
And the unifying force that meta-narrative is immense.
It's designed to transcend difference. Whether you were an immigrant arriving on the East Coast or a farmer in the Midwest, the American dream offered a unifying concept that cut across social, economic, and racial lines. It was a common aspiration for a better future that provided meaning to collective effort.
It also provides a kind of psychological resilience.
A profound source of resilience. During periods of immense challenge, the Great Depression, global conflict, economic recessions, that promise of upward mobility acted as a psychological beacon of hope, reminding people of their collective strength and preventing the entire system from collapsing into despair.
But the woman at the dinner party, the faculty member, was clinically dedicated to dissolving that beacon. This is where the acidic solvent of postmodern deconstruction enters the picture.
The radical ideology operates precisely by dissolving the bonds of civilizational continuity. Institutions, universities, major media, publishing houses that once transmitted the shared thought world are repurposed as engines of deconstruction, shattering common discourse and replacing shared myths with what we can call a corrosive historical nihilism.
This philosophical shift has a defining term, which was popularized by Jean-François Lyotard: incredulity toward grand narratives.
That phrase is the thesis statement of postmodernism. It expresses a fundamental mistrust of meta-narratives. The grand stories of progress, the Enlightenment project, universal emancipation, or even the scientific search for ultimate truth. Post-structuralist thinkers argued that these grand narratives were inherently oppressive because they imposed a singular universal truth, thereby dismissing the natural chaos of the universe and marginalizing the individual fragmented experience.
So the goal was to break down the big shared story into smaller, localized stories.
That's the proposed replacement. Petit récits, or modest, fragmented, and localized narratives. If the American dream is the meta-narrative, the goal is to replace it with millions of personalized, isolated narratives focused on identity, grievance, and subjective experience. This leads to a multiplicity of coexisting viewpoints, none of which command universal assent, which results in the loss of a singular, functional truth.
And the consequence for the social organism, as Mr. Miller witnessed, is structural failure. When you dissolve the foundational social adhesive, what happens?
You return to the atomized individual, but this time the atomization is ideological. When every hero, every value, every founding myth is dissolved through this constant ideological critique, the structure offers no shared purpose, no collective connection, and no historical continuity. The individual is left adrift, and the vacuum created by the loss of this social adhesive must be filled. It's often filled by the therapeutic state, performative politics, or the expansion of institutional control aimed at managing grievance rather than pursuing excellence.
So if the diagnosis is pervasive nihilism, we need a prescription for continuity. How do we start rebuilding this shared reality?
The reconstruction of order must begin with an unflinching loyalty to reality and the reaffirmation that some truths are functional necessities. We have to reclaim the core Enlightenment values of logic and reason, the absolute functional truth that 2 + 2 = 4, and the recognition of the natural laws underpinning social cohesion, like the structural necessity of the family unit. Without a commitment to objective reality, all discourse just dissolves.
But given the deep ideological capture of what we once considered reliable institutions, the universities, the media, how can this counter-narrative, this loyalty to reality, even be transmitted? The sources suggest building parallel orders outside these zombie institutions.
That is the sober strategic imperative. When core structures are captured and repurposed as engines of deconstruction, the functionalist response is to build resilient structures elsewhere. This is what's called the remnant approach to education. The transmission of the civilizational corpus, the West's accumulated wisdom, the great books, the Enlightenment values, must occur in what we might call cognitive sanctuaries.
Meaning supporting educational models that prioritize continuity and truth over ideology.
Precisely. This includes the dedicated revival of classical education centered on the great books texts that teach critical thinking, moral virtue, and historical context, and robust, sustained support for homeschooling movements and independent academies. These efforts are not a cultural retreat. They are the creation of resilient nodes designed specifically to preserve and transmit the foundational knowledge and the shared thought world that the mainstream is actively dissolving.
And finally, what should the posture of the individual citizen be in this environment? If the fireworks and forced optimism are the wrong tools, what is the right mental framework?
The right framework is a posture of tragic realism. It calls for a stoic patriotism. This isn't an uncritical blind allegiance. It fully acknowledges historical flaws, contradictions, moral failures, but it remains fiercely dedicated to the excellence and success of the shared experiment.
It's about personal duty, not performative grievance.
Exactly. It is about preserving the founding adhesives through dedicated action and belief in objective reality, ensuring the structure doesn't drift entirely into systemic entropy.
So we've completed a comprehensive structural integrity inspection across these three distinct but interconnected load-bearing walls.
We've diagnosed three systematic failures working in concert. First, the dissolution of the family, leading to the loneliness epidemic and mass social anomie. Second, the sacrifice of merit, leading to institutional fragility and catastrophic systemic inefficiency, as we see in our critical institutions. And third, the deconstruction of shared myths, leading to historical nihilism and the loss of social adhesive.
The cultural conflict we see every day is therefore not the messy birth pangs of progress, but the systematic, coordinated deconstruction of organic, necessary structures. The sober strategy required for this civilizational winter is not a forced party, but a rigorous, fundamental reconstruction based on functional necessity.
And the true significance of approaching the 250th anniversary lies not in grand, empty speeches, but in reestablishing fixed coordinates for navigation. This requires the unflinching reaffirmation that the nuclear family is, empirically, the bedrock of social cohesion, and that the integrity of our civilization demands objective competence and meritocratic excellence elevated above the cult of mediocrity. These functional truths, the stability of the foundation, the strength of the walls, and the coherence of the roof, are what ensure the house stands, regardless of the ideological weather outside.